Call It Courage, Chapter 3, pages 35 through 61. There was a fan of light spreading in the east. Mafatu stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment he lay there motionless in the cool mosses, forgetful of the events which had cast him upon this strange shore. Then it all came crowding back upon him, and he scarcely dared to believe that there was earth, solid earth, beneath him, that once more Moana, the sea god, had been cheated. He struggled to sit upright, then fell back upon one elbow. Yuri lay close at hand, holding a robber crab in his forepaws, cracking the tough shell and extracting the meat with gusto. There was Kiwi, too, with his beak tucked back under his wing in sleep. Kiwi, who had led his friends to this island. Mafatu pulled himself to a sitting position. The action called for more strength than he realized. He was giddy with thirst, and there was an odd weakness in his limbs. His right leg was swollen and painful. He remembered then that he had banged it against the coral when his canoe struck. He discovered that there was a gash on his calf. He must take care of it, for coral wounds were poisonous. The chuckle of cascade reaching his ears and made him aware of the stabbing need of water. He plunged his face into the pool and drank deeply. Then, prompted more by instinct than by conscious thought, he withdrew to let the water run down his swollen throat sparingly with caution. Its cool magic stole through his tissues, bringing with it new life and restoring force. He sighed and sank back on the mossy bank, relishing the strength that quickened his tired body. Soon he must find food. There were thousands of coconut trees on every hand, rich with green fruit, but Mfatu was not yet strong enough to climb. Later he would try it. Then he would make a fire too, and he must search the island to find out if it was inhabited and there was a shelter to build. Oh, there was much to do. He hardly knew where to begin, but now it was enough just to lie there and feel strength returning, to know that he was safe from the sea. The sea. He shuddered. Maui, god of the fishermen, had carried him safely across the ocean currents. Please stop here and answer question 1. Yuri, the boy muttered thickly, we're alive. It wasn't all a bad dream. It really happened. The answering wag of his dog's tail was further assurance of reality. As Mafatu's brain cleared of cobwebs, a sudden thought brought him up swiftly. This silent island was not Tahiti. What island was it then? Did it belong to the Black Eaters of Men? Were they even now watching him from secret places in the jungle, biding their time? He glanced about in apprehension. But the solitude was unbroken save for the soft cooing of ghost terns and the gentle plash of the cascade. On his left hand, far offshore, the reef boomed to the charging surf. The curve of the beach reached out like two great arms to enclose the lagoon. Coconuts and panadunas trooped in shining legions to the very edge of the sea. A flight of green and purple parakeets flashed across the sky and vanished. There was no other sign of life. No voices of men, no laughter of children, no footprint in the sand. The volcanic peak that formed the background of the island rose perhaps 3,000 feet straight up out of the sea. It was the cone of a volcano long extinct. From its base, ridges of congealed lava flowed down to the distant shore. Once, in the dim beginnings of the world, this mountain had belched forth fire and brimstone, spreading destruction over the land. But the forgotten jungle, through fertile century, has crept back up the slopes, clothing them in green. The boy rose and stood stretching his stiff limbs. The water had restored him, and he felt much stronger. But he found that the earth heaved with the sea's own motion, and he swayed to keep his balance. His leg still pained, and he would need the juice of limes to cauterize the coral root and purao leaves to make the healing bandage. Nearby was a tree loaded with wild limes. He plucked half a dozen of the fruits, broke them on a bit of coral, and squeezed the juice into the wound. He winced as the caustics stung, but when he had bound on the leafy bandage with a twist of vine, it seemed that already his leg felt better. Soon the swelling would be gone. Please stop here and answer question 2. Close at hand, he discovered a rude trail made by wild pigs and goats in their wanderings across the mountain. The trail led up through the foothills to a high plateau which, the boy decided, would make a splendid outlook. From that point of vantage he would be able to survey his entire island and sea for the distance of many miles. He followed the path where it led back into the jungle along the course of the swift-flowing stream. The trail sloped up sharply, and Mafatu pulled himself up by roots and trailing lianas, now climbing, now crawling flat on his stomach. He found that he had to stop every now and then to catch his breath. Yuri ran beside him, dashing off on this scent and that, the dog's shrill, sharp bark shattering the morning stillness. For a quarter of a mile the coconuts held, beautiful trees that were more luxurious than any in Hikaru. It was always thus in the rich soil of the volcanic islands. Then came a belt of breadfruit and wild bananas, of oranges and guavas and mangoes. The roots of the mapei tree, the island chestnut, twisted over the ground in the strange, tormented shapes. Vines trailed like aerial ropes from the high branches where orchids bloomed, while little parakeets fled on swift wings and vanished in the green gloom. Mafatu had never before seen woods like these, for Hikaru was open and windswept. These endless legions of trees seemed to close in upon him, imprison him with reaching arms, with heady odors, with eerie light and shadow. Ferns grew higher than a tall man's head. The roof of leaves was powdered with starry blossoms. By the time Mafatu reached the plateau he was exhausted and his leg throbbed with pain. He lay down full length upon the volcanic rock and watched wild goats leaping from peak to peak high above his head and heard their shrill bleating in the clean air. When he caught his breath he sat up again and looked about. The plateau appeared to divide the island into halves. From his vantage point the boy could see its whole circumference. He was hoping desperately for some sign of the human habitation, yet fearing it too, for who knew whether humans might prove friends or enemies? He almost hoped that the island was uninhabited, but if it were, he shivered as he realized his isolation. Even at sea, in his small canoe, he had not felt so utterly alone as he did here on this strange high island. Everything about it was alien and forbidding. He stood there looking off in the southwest, and all at once his heart gave a jump and he strained forward. A cone shape, vague as a cloud upon the horizon, showed him the existence of another high island. It must have been 50 miles distant. As the boy watched eagerly, scarcely daring to believe the testimony of his eyes, he saw what might have been a column of smoke lifting high into the air from the peak of the cone. He had heard Grandfather Rao tell of the Smoking Islands, a home of savage tribes. They were the dark islands of the eaters of men. Was that distant island one such? Perhaps this very island upon which he stood belonged to them too. It was a terrible thought. Please stop here and answer question 3. As he stood there surveying his world, the wind that swept up from the wide Pacific beat hard against him, whistling in his ears. Almost he had to lean against it to keep his balance. It was a southwest wind that blew straight from the smoking island, whipping the sea to anger. Inside the barrier reef the water deepened and the shoaled in changing hues. Up there the whole world seemed consumed with light and color. Far off a mist of gulls drifted above the breaking surf, their hoarse cries unceasing as the hum within a shell. Towering above Mafatu's head, the basalt cone of the island looked as soft in hue as an amethyst, broken and worn by 1,000 years of wind and storm. He observed that the barrier reef encircled the entire island. There were only 2 openings in the reef through which canoes might enter. One opening lay on the side of the island where Mafatu had been cast ashore. The other was here to the southwest, facing the distant Smoking Island. In each case the opening was caused by a river which flowed from the mountain down into the lagoon, for the tiny coral polyp which builds up its ramparts from the floor of the sea cannot stand fresh water. Wherever a river flows into the sea, there will be a breach in the barrier reef. Mafatu jumped in alarm as a wild boar crashed through the undergrowth. It was so close that the boy caught a glimpse of its dark hide. Yuri leaped in pursuit, barking furiously. Mafatu relaxed, and a smile crossed his face. Pig roasted, underground in the hot oven stones of the Umu. Ooh-wee! His mouth watered at the golden prospect. He would make a spear and kill the puau. That's what he would do. He was fired with excitement and set for the adventure. Then the thought of killing a wild boar in single-handed combat struck him dumb with wonder. Why, he would never have dreamed of such a thing in Hikaru. He was Mafatu, the boy who was afraid. He set his jaw with fierce resolution. He had never known a man who killed a wild pig, but Grandfather Ruao, who had traveled as far as distant Tahiti, had told how the warriors of that island killed pigs in the mountains with naught but a knife for a weapon, bracing themselves so that the animal impaled itself upon the blade. It needed a strong arm and a stouter heart. Could he, Mafatu, ever accomplish such a feat? Grandfather brought back with him a necklace made from the curling tusks of the boar, and Mafatu could remember to this day how the dark blue scrolls of tattooing on the old man's copper flesh set off the handsome ivory teeth. That necklace was the envy of every man in Hikaru, and its possession earned Grandfather much respect. "I will make such a necklace for myself from the tusks," the boy promised bravely, "and when I return to Hikaru men will look up to me and say, 'There goes Mafatu, he killed the wild boar single-handed,' and Tavananui, my father, will be filled with pride." Please stop here and answer questions 4 and 5. The prospect of returning home set another train of thought in motion. "I must find a tree, a tamanu, for my canoe," the boy said aloud. "I will burn it out, then make in a days of basalt to finish it. I'll plait a sail of pandanus, and oh, it will be a wonderful canoe." At that moment his eye fell upon a mango tree loaded with juicy fruit, and he plucked a fruit and sank his teeth into the rosy pulp. For a few seconds, while he ate his fill and the juices ran down his chin, he forgot all about his canoe, forgot that he needed shelter, food, fire, and weapons. Then, his hunger satisfied, his mind ran ahead again to the happy days when he would set sail for Hikaru, with all his demons put to rout and the bright flame of courage burning in his heart. Never again would he be called Mafatu, the boy who was afraid. He stood there taut with purpose, high above the demon sea. "Maui, god of the fishermen, hear me!" he pleaded. "I shall return home one day, I swear it. My father, Tavananui, will be filled with pride at my homecoming. It is a vow that I take now, O Maui. I have spoken." The wind from the sea swept up around him, its voice warm and soft and reassuring in his ear. Maui, god of the fishermen, had heard and answered. But Fatu decided that before he retraced his steps to his own beach he would explore the opposite side of the island. The trail dropped from the plateau in a series of swift turns and spirals. The boy clambered down, slipping and sliding, catching hold of roots and vines to keep from falling. Far below, a cool, dark stream wound its way through the sheltered valley. Perhaps in that valley he would find some people. At the base of the ancient crater, long ridges of lava descended to the valley. Of a sudden Mafatu remembered an old tale out of his childhood. He had been told how the youths of Tahiti slid down the lava slide on sleds of giant leaves. The thought had scarcely struck him before he was wrenching off half a dozen great leaves from a nearby banana tree. Even as he did so he stopped, suddenly alert. They were splendid trees, 3 times his own height, with broad leaves that waved in the wind like tattered banners. But what caught and held his attention were the stems where fruit had grown. They had been severed cleanly by a knife. His heart gave a great thump and hung fire. He examined the stems with care. Tree after tree had been stripped of fruit, and within a week, too. Who had cut these bananas? Well, he would have to find out. His lips were grim as he set about making his sled. He bound the leaves together with a fibrous rope of vines and soon had a toboggan as long as his body. When Mafatu reached the lava slide, he set his sled in place and flung himself down upon it. With a shout and a shove, he was off. Down the natural slide he sped at terrifying speed. Trees whizzed past, wind drove the air from his nostrils, the valley rushed to meet him. He brought up with a bump in a thicket of cassie. As he extricated himself from the thorns he was still breathing with excitement. "Hoo-wee, but that was fun!" He did not stop to think about how he would regain his plateau, for at the moment his eyes fell upon a broad, well-defined path leading down through the jungle. "Hi-ya!" he exclaimed. "This fine trail was never made by the feet of wild pigs." The boy stood there irresolute and uncertain. Some premonition of danger kept him poised, alert, and wary. He was half tempted to retrace his way and explore no further. Then an overpowering desire to know who had made that path urged him onward. The trail led toward the sea, widening as it went. Soon it opened into a cleared circle some 100 feet in circumference. Involuntarily Mafatu started forward, then drew back with a sharp cry. What he beheld filled him with awe, and it set him trembling. He saw a series of wide stone terraces rising in a pyramid many feet high. On top of this pyramid a grotesque idol, hideously ugly, reared in the brilliant sunshine. It was an ancient idol, its contours softened with fungus and lichens, corroded by the rains of ages. The roots of convolvulus writhed about its base. No wind reached this hidden circle, and insects hummed in the hot air. The Fatu felt that he was stifling. His heart pounded. A moray, a sacred place. Scarcely daring to breathe, he advanced a step, then he drew up short. Around the base of the idol he saw piles of bones, charred, but not old. The platform was strewn with them, bones too large for dogs, too large for pigs. And then Mafatu understood. His heart congealed. This was a Motu taboo, a forbidden island. Here the eaters of men made their terrible sacrifices to the Varau Ino. Please stop here and answer question 6. Mafatu stood rooted, unable to advance, powerless to flee. Yuri slunk at his side, growling low, the hair on the back of his neck lifting stiffly. Involuntarily the boy looked up. Through an opening in the trees the cloud cone of Smoking Island floated on a wine-colored sea. Could that distant island be the home of the savages who used this Motu taboo for their place of sacrifice? Was it here that they came in their black canoes to turn the night hideous with their drums and ceremonies and leaping fires? Mafatu shivered. He had believed that Maui, god of the fishermen, had led him safe to this island, but perhaps after all it had only been a cruel prank of Moana, the sea god, angry at having been cheated. The boy seemed to hear Moana saying, someday, Mafatu, I will claim you. It was evident that the savages had been here recently, for the piles of ashes rested undisturbed by wind and storm. The cleared circle seemed to hold its breath, locked in a supernatural silence. As the boy paused, irresolute, looking up at the towering moray, his eye was caught and held by a gleam of light, and his heart gave a mighty leap, for he saw that a spearhead lay on the sacred platform, finely ground, sharp-edged, a spear for food, a weapon against death, attack. Dare he take it? Please stop here and answer question 7. It might mean death. His heart pounded. He moved 1 foot forward. His hands were damp and cold. The flashing spearhead winked back at him like an evil eye. The boy's limbs turned to water. For a second he was powerless to move. In that moment, had a score of black men leaped forth from the jungle, he could not have stirred or cried. He fought himself for control. Taking a deep breath, he whispered, "It is you, Maui, who have led me to this island. I know it. Do not forsake me now." Almost it seemed as if he could see dark shadows moving among the ferns and hear the phantom whispers of voices. But he edged forward, poised for instant flight. There. He was so close to the idol that he could have touched it. He reached out his hand. It took every ounce of will. The spearhead glistened brightly. His fingers closed about it, tightened. The towering idol cast a shadow of darkness across the green earth. Quickly the boy drew the spearhead toward him, but in moving he dislodged a bone. It fell at his feet. Its touch was deathly cold. Mafatu gasped. Then he whipped about and was running, but he still gripped the spearhead in his fist. He scrambled back up the path whence he had come. His heart was hammering, his legs stiff and sore. The twisted roots of the mape tree reached for him as he fled. Never had they seemed so much like grasping fingers. The giant tree ferns turned the jungle to an eerie gloom. The boy was filled with unaccountable dread. His limbs seemed weighted. When at last he reached the base of the lava slide, he turned at right angles and fought his way upward, pulling himself up by vines. At last he gained the plateau, drew up breathless and panting. The spear flashed in his hand. He looked down it in wonder. Nothing had happened to him. He had touched the moray, dislodged a bone in the place taboo, yet still he lived. The sun shone. The sky arched blue. Nothing was changed. And this spear, oh wee, but it was a beautiful one. It was worth all the risk. Those eaters of men had wrought well. Now he, Mafatu, could kill the wild pig. Now he could defend himself against attack. But, most important of all, he knew that he had won a great victory over himself. He had forced himself to do something that he dreaded, something that took every ounce of his will. The taste of victory salted his lips. He threw out his chest and cried, "It is you, Maui, who have helped me. My thanks to you." Yuri leapt and pranced with excitement at his master's side. Please stop here and answer question 8. Back once more at his own shelter, Mafatu kept looking and looking at the spear. Happiness flooded through him in warm tides. It was not so much the possession of a spear, no, it was the fact that he had touched the moray. That took courage, aye, courage. And as he set about searching for a firestick, he sang a song at the top of his young lungs. It was a brave song of Tarawao, a hero god who rose out of the sea to slay the enemies of his people. His voice was clear and strong across the jungle stillness. Seabirds and parakeets hushed their cries to listen to the strange intruding sound. At last Mafatu found a firestick to his liking, a piece of hard wood, bone dry, as large around as his forearm. Then he searched for a smaller piece of the same wood. Propping the larger piece against the rock, he squatted on his haunches before it and gripped the smaller sliver in both hands. He began to move it back and forth upon the hard surface. A groove commenced to form. A little pile of wood dust gathered at one extremity of the groove. Now the boy's hands were moving faster and faster. Back and forth they flew, while perspiration stood out on his forehead and his breath came in gasps. At last he was rewarded. A wisp of smoke drifted upward from the wood dust, a glow. The boy seized a few twigs and, cupping his hands with great care, blew upon the spark. A flame burst into life. He had made fire. Weary with the exertion, Mafatu settled back on his haunches and watched the leaping flame. Fire. His arms and back ached unmercifully, the wound on his leg throbbed, but the warm glow of flame comforted him. It made him think of home, of food and warmth and companionship, of faces around the evening circle, of the drone of old men's voices telling their endless tales of daring. And he was swept by a sudden wave of loneliness, a longing for the sound of his father's deep voice. He shut his lips tight and fought it back, then leapt to his feet and set back about his small tasks with a great show of busyness. He would not think of those things. He would not remember, if he could help it. Now he would have cooked food, warmed when he was wet through, and the first implement with which to set about building his canoe. Tomorrow he would fell a tree by fire and start to work upon his dugout. He would make fire only by day, and then not too large a blaze, for its glow might be visible on the distant island of the Eaters of Men. Thus he forced his thoughts into safer channels. Please stop here and answer question 9. He threw breadfruit into the fire. There it would stay until it was charred black and thoroughly cooked. Next he laid half a dozen fehi (wild bananas) in the coals, covering them with wet leaves so that slowly they would steam through. While his dinner was cooking he had yet another task to do. He set about it at once. He tore off half a dozen fronds of a low-growing cocoanut tree. Then he began to plait them into flat mat-like screens. These, made into a lean-to, would be his shelter against wind and storm. Several layers of them would make it waterproof. "If I only had my knife, Yuri," the boy groaned. "How simple it would be! I must search the lagoon for a pahuas shell. It grinds down to a fine cutting edge. We'll soon have a good knife." Yuri thought so too. That was evident from the motion of his tireless tail. "Perhaps," Mafatu thought suddenly, "I might find a knife at the sacred place of the Eaters of Men." Then he shook his head. "No, I shall never return to that terrible moray taboo." But each day he resolved he would climb to the high plateau, his lookout to the southwest. Some day, the Eaters of Men would come back. Before long, perhaps. Mafatu was certain of it, and he was certain that the sun shone and was warm. It was inevitable, and when the black men came he would have to leave, or die. The boy looked fondly at the tamanu tree that he had marked already for his canoe. "Tomorrow I shall start work upon it," he promised, "and aye, what a canoe I shall build! Deep and strong but light, an outrigger as swift and powerful as a shark's tail, and when my father sees it he will say, 'Oh oui, my son, but they have built fine canoes in that island you have come from.' And then I will say, 'But I built it myself, my father.' And then he will say, 'Aye, is that possible, this fine canoe?'" The fire blazed brightly, and the breadfruit gave forth a tempting odor. Jets of vapor rose from the steaming bananas. Yuri snuggled down at his master's side, and Mafatu hugged the dog close. "Aye, there is food for you too, my brother," he cried, "and tomorrow we shall have fish. See my spear, how bravely it flashes! I will make a new shaft for it, and then I will kill the meow, the shark, and the wild pig too. Aye, Yuri, you will see." The boy pulled the breadfruit from the fire and broke it in half.
Its white, flaky meat was packed with sustenance, a little like bread in taste, a trifle like potato, better than either. The boy gave half of it to Yuri. The dog circled around, sniffing longingly as he waited for his dinner to cool. The bananas popped from their skins while their juices bubbled in the heat. Deftly, Mavatu slid them out of the fire, transferred them to a broad leaf that served as a plate. Then, unmindful of his burned fingers, he fell upon the hot food. He was famished. It seemed that he had never been so hungry in his whole life, and for a time there was only the sound of greedy munching. Never had food tasted so good. He ate until his stomach could hold no more. Then a great weariness stole through his limbs. With a sigh of deep content he sat back upon the cool sand and closed his eyes. Yuri snuggled close, warm and friendly against his side. Overhead the plaited fronds of the palms formed a snug shelter. Some day, the boy thought drowsily, I will make my roof watertight, but not yet. The tide was running out of the lagoon with the sunset in a whispering hum of sound, like the reassuring hush of a mother to her child. Mafatu lay there under his lean-to, relaxed in every nerve. He had fire, food, shelter. He had faced Moana the sea god. He had dared the sacred Moray of the Eaters of Men to win his spear. There was a new-found confidence singing in his heart. He had found a new belief in himself. At peace with himself and his world, he slept.
Please stop here and answer question 10.